Oh yes, this is this. Well, good morning everyone. Thank you for joining us on this very, very warm Brussels morning. On this event on China's investment in Africa and consequences for Europe, this is a topic that we will actually do more of, certainly on the Chinese aspect, but also on the relationship with Africa. We have an incomplete panel up till now, but we're hoping that the last speaker will join us. But I think we should start, if you don't mind, I think we should start. We only have till 10:30, so I think it's important to make a start. On my left, let me briefly introduce you our speakers, Solange Chatelard, who will go first in this presentation. Then we have Alicia. Everybody knows Alicia. She's a fellow here at Bruegel. And then on the far left, I have Estelle Youssoufa, who's a news anchor from France. And we are hoping to get also the last speaker from Huawei, but has not arrived yet. Why don't we take about 10 minutes for initial comments, each one of you? Then we will get perhaps a small conversation between us, and then afterwards we will open up for questions from the audience. That's okay with you? So why don't we ask with Solange? Can we start with you? Yes, you have there is this. You need to point in this direction when you change the slides. Yeah. Well, they will put the slides on if you might. And thank you for joining us so early.
Is it the microphone on?
Can we have the slides on, please, for Solange? Yeah.
So I'll maybe just start off by thanking the organisers for inviting me here at this event, and I'm very honoured to be part of this very distinguished panel. And I'm also delighted to see that there are many women here. One of the speakers who's missing, if I'm not mistaken, is a man, but very often I speak on panels and I'm very often the only woman, so it's always it's very rewarding to see other women here. So I think we have a slight problem with the size. In terms of the presentation. And also a quick caveat. So I'm not an economist. I know this is an economic think tank. I'm a political scientist by training, and I do most of my research in Africa, in Zambia. So what I'm going to do this morning is maybe sort of, before we go into the number crunching and before we go into the really sort of complex macroeconomic dimensions of this relationship, I'd like to give you some sort of broader historical contextualization of how China situates itself vis-a-vis Africa. And hopefully I'm going to try and do it from a relatively Chinese perspective. So I'm going to start off with showing you a map of old Beijing. I don't know how many of you are familiar with China, with Beijing in particular, but this is what Beijing looks like. It's built around a concentric system with the imperial city right at its center, the Forbidden City as you see here, surrounded by the imperial city, which is where all those servicing the emperor lived, so his eunuchs, his ministers, etc. Then the inner city here, surrounded by a huge wall, and 11 gates and watchtowers, and then the outer city. If you've been to Beijing recently, the architecture of the city has expanded considerably. We've got about 5 or 6 or 7 of these ring roads around Beijing now, and these are the original ones. And in the early 1960s, I'm going to start with a story of a young French diplomat who's a veteran diplomat who went on to become the French ambassador in Beijing in the late 90s. He had his first mission to China in the early 60s at the cusp of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. So what did he see when he arrived in Beijing in the early 60s? Well, first of all, this huge city wall that you see was actually still around. Just to give you an idea of how imposing that was, this is one of the watchtowers around that tower. That's the one in the southeast tower. And the former European diplomatic area was here, right opposite Tiananmen, here in Nidatinmen. And that was where the European delegation was. And that was all let's say, the imperial powers. So you had the French, the British, the Austro-Hungarians, the Italians, the Germans, the Belgians, the Japanese, the Russians, the Americans. They were all here, really strategically at the door of China's imperial city. So if you'd arrived any time in Beijing in the start of the 20th century, you were a diplomat, that's where you were, very, very close to central power. What happens in 1949, once the PRC comes into power, is that they move this foreign presence from the proximity of the heart of political power. And they create 2 new diplomatic compounds in the city, outside of the old inner city walls. So the first diplomatic compound is here, Temple of the Sun, really outside the inner city. So it's a very clear strategic move for them to create a distance. Temple of the Sun is Zhitan Gongyuan, near Jianguomen, for anybody who is familiar with Beijing. And this first diplomatic compound was essentially built for all those joining the socialist camp. So Vietnam, Korea, Mongolia, Poland, Romania, etc. Then a second one was built slightly further north, 3 lees away. A li in China is a measure word, a bit like a kilometer, 3 lees away, and that's why it became Sanlitun, which is 3 lees away. So if you're familiar with Sanlitun in Beijing, now it's sort of a center for tourism, for commerce, for business, and it's just situated here. I'm having some problems with this light there. North here, just outside of Dongzhimen. And this is essentially a new diplomatic compound that was built for the new states that were arriving since decolonization. So you had Cameroon, you had Congo, you had Morocco, Algeria, and that was where the new French embassy was established, sandwiched in between the new embassy for Syria that recently gained independence and was formerly under French tutelage, and Equatorial New Guinea. So the reason I think it's important to start with this vignette is really to contextualize kind of how Beijing sees kind of the global south and Africa as part of that. The two main takeaways, I would say, is China has actually been interested in what's been happening beyond its borders for a very long time, particularly to what was happening to former European empires. And it has really managed its relationship strategically with the global south in order to work its way in this kind of shifting international system. It's really through its relationship with the global south that China has positioned itself in the larger landscape of the wider international state system. So I think that's the first point. Africa is essentially not a new item of interest on China's agenda. It's been there for a very long time. And the second issue is really to give you an idea of, not necessarily to provincialize Europe, because Europe, of course, is essential for China, but really to contextualize what Europe means to China in a broader context of geopolitical competition. And China's actually primary rival, some would say it's the United States, and I would argue it was probably the Soviet Union from the 50s onwards. But so as to tell you, how Europe situates itself compared to other things. So to give you an idea, China makes a massive push into Africa in the 1960s. And we're talking sending out volunteers, distributing aid. This is a picture of, a barefoot doctor. But what it's really exporting is its ideology, its Maoism. So there are two strategic reasons that China makes a push into Africa. The first, of course, is the strategic competition with Taiwan, or a proxy war with the United States. So Taiwan has official embassies all across the African continent. So China is not officially recognized as, Beijing, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, doesn't have a seat at the UN Security Council until 1971. So up until 1971, China is actively pushing for Beijing to become the official China, in the eyes of the international community. That's the first strategic competition. The second one, of course, which is the most critical one, is the Sino-Soviet split in the middle of the 50s. And what does that mean? This is really a very important historical period where China essentially goes from being the junior partner in the International Communist Alliance to the torchbearer of international revolution. So this is a very, very important point and explains a lot of China's big power moves, both in Africa but across the rest of the planet. So China basically, after the Khrushchev shift, China essentially claims that it is the true legitimate guardian of the Marxist, Leninist ideal of revolution. And it manifests itself most concretely in the form of the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, which remains to this day the single largest Chinese aid project on the African continent. And what it is, you have this kind of ideological alignment between President Nyerere of Tanzania, Mao Zedong, and Kenneth Kaunda, who's the first president of Zambia. And essentially, it's linking this country, Zambia, where I do all my research, which is a country that is enclaved, it has no access to the sea. It is surrounded by, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, by colonial governments. We're talking Portuguese governments, the Belgian government. It's got Zimbabwe, Botswana, South Africa under the apartheid regime. So really no one who's going to give it access to the critical exit it needs. And Tanzania, with President Nyerere, strikes an alliance, and they say, we'll give you access to the port of Dar es Salaam, but we need a railway to basically de-enclave the country. Just a little bit of background. So Zambia, as you see, this landlocked country, is a copper-producing country, essentially. And most of the copper and the cobalt is situated in the north of the country here in what we call the Copper Belt province. It shares its longest border with the Congo here in the north. And this is the Katanga region of the DRC, where a lot of the natural resources in the DRC are. So the cobalt and the copper that you hear that we're mining in Congo comes from here. This is the Copper Belt. And then, of course, Angola here in the west. I mean, very quickly, the project involved 100,000 people, including Tanzania, Zambia workers, etc. The railway still works today. It's a single-line track. It's about 2,000 kilometers across very hostile territory. I mean, this is a colossal project. You know, it really mobilizes the minds and the imaginations of the masses, both in China and in Africa. And it's still around. But of course, you know, the world has changed today. And what has changed? Well, two, I think, very important things have changed. On the international level, China is no longer challenging the Soviet Union, okay? That is no longer a major competitor. I think we've all seen Beijing has beaten Moscow, at least on the level of regime survival. That competition is a game over. Second, it's also kind of won the diplomatic race against Taiwan on the African continent. Today, there is only one Taiwanese embassy left on the continent, and that's at Eswatini, which used to be former Swaziland, which is a small enclave country, mountainous country in South Africa. And Taiwan has two representative missions, one in South Africa and one in Nigeria. The race is still on in other parts of the world. In Latin and Central America, for instance, there are still about 9 Taiwanese embassies and maybe many more official consulates and representative missions. But essentially on the African continent, Beijing has wiped out that race with Taiwan. And at the domestic level, we've got what we call China's crisis of success. So 3 and 4 decades of frenetic growth has essentially led to very, very serious economic bottlenecks and deep structural imbalances within the economy. And you know, you're all economists, so there's nothing really I can teach you here, but essentially sort of the conditions and the circumstances which enabled China's miraculous growth for the last 3 decades have become, I would say, an obstacle to China's growth in the future. So essentially, it has to change its business model. We talk about the structural imbalances. I mean, it doesn't, basically, China has several, I think maybe 25, 26 provinces altogether, but the point is, you know, less than half of these provinces are, you know, account for the lion's share of economic growth across the country. So you've got really the coastal provinces that are really huge powerhouses and a lot of kind of lesser development towards the inland of the country. And what you're seeing essentially is an overcapacity in some fields and China's being under-resourced in another. So you've got overcapacity in terms of industry, in terms of construction, particularly in sectors where the Chinese have been heavily overinvesting domestically, but also since the early 2000s, you've also have, to some extent, financial overcapacity with huge foreign exchange reserves. Those have been dwindling, I mean, slowing down recently, but in the early 2000s, you know, China had to think, what are we going to do with all this money? We had to invest it. And you also have, of course, you know, labor rate wages that are rising. And it's under-resourced. It has basically, you know, limited natural resources. It's limited in terms of energy as well. And China essentially, you know, might get old before it gets rich. You know, so it's facing this very important period of its demographic dividend where it has to decide how is it going to sustain, you know, the growth of its economy in the next few phases. It also, so just very quickly, it can't rely on traditional export markets. It's got falling profit rates. So it has to focus on, you know, it has to essentially, you know, revamp, you know, its business model. I think a lot of us here are aware of that. So it's the China 2025, you know, where China wants to become a leader in critical technologies in certain critical areas, digital technologies, AI, automation, etc. I mean, I'm not an economist, as I said, but I think China's new development model, it relies on 2 different things. So deep reform domestically, which is essentially focusing on indigenous innovation, domestic consumption, but also, and more importantly, what I call socio-demographic alignment. And that means handling the growing disenchanted populations and masses who are not basically benefiting from the windfall of reform. And that is huge. And as we were talking about that earlier in Hong Kong, that's what we're seeing. You know, there's a very, very significant social disenchantment that, of course, has, you know, tangents with feeling economically excluded to some extent, but I think that's very important. And of course, deeper economic integration can also help China resolve or at least absorb some of its problems. This, of course, has led China, you know, on a massive shopping spree, on expansion, first in the early 2000s to the go-out policy, and it has morphed, it has graduated into the Belt and Road Initiative. So I'm just really going to go through kind of some of the classic images that we see. It's created a lot of fear. This extension, this idea, this push outwards, which is essentially generated from the next round of domestic structural reforms, has been perceived as very aggressive, you know, as a manifestation of China's growing assertiveness. And at least on the African continent, this is what we're seeing. You know, China's coming in, it's sweeping in, and it's taking over like a new colonizer. On the other side, so on the one hand, you have sort of this paranoia and this fear of China kind of taking over. And then on the other hand, you have the Chinese who'd like us to believe that this is really actually what is happening on the continent. You know, brother countries, brother nations, all weather friends, etc. So really, when you're an observer and an analyst and a scholar of this relationship, you're really kind of sandwiched between these two poles, these two polarized visions, and there's very little research and analysis that tries to go into the gray area. It tries to say, well, it's neither really just pure neocolonialism, and it's not this kind of propaganda friendship that the Chinese government would like to say. What you see and what people hear are generally the vanity projects, the big infrastructure projects like pipelines, roads, bridges, stadiums. You also hear about, of course, China's cheap credit lines and the cheap credit that China's giving different countries in Africa. This is very important. But a growing part of this story, and that's actually what my research focuses on specifically, is the story of private migrants and individuals who are going out there. And this is really a major part of the story that we're not hearing about. We tend to think that the story is one of top-down Beijing sending its people and its company and its money to Africa, whereas in quantitative numbers, at least, not financial numbers, but at numerical numbers, a lot of these people are private enterprises, private families going out there, including, even these big, large, state-owned enterprises. They need to be manned by staff. And a lot of these managers, these company managers and the employees are basically being recruited domestically through labor recruitment. So what we're seeing is really kind of a deep transformation, the restructuring of the labor market in China, and the reorganization of these labor markets in Africa. But the private stories is really the dimension that I like to insist on. So this is, someone who's, professionals who've already had a life in China, who start a second life in Zambia in different sectors, services, manufacturing, but also in things that we would never, expect, like in, rural agriculture, for example. So I think that's what we'd like to talk about. And why is that important? Well, because a lot of these firms, if you see here, this is a Standard Chartered bank, and they're advertising their services. Why? Because there's simply a very, very vast or growing Chinese population in the country. And Chinese businesses and foreign businesses come in and make money out of them because it's new money in the country. It's dynamism, it's economic dynamism. So this is what you would see. If you land in Lusaka, the capital of Zambia, and you drive into the town, there's one main artery that is a road paved, and you can go into the town center. You see this, and you will see this everywhere. And these Chinese companies that are essentially contractors, they're contractors, they're funded by maybe a Chinese development bank or a bilateral bank, or maybe the EU or the USAID, but they're essentially contractors, servicing a domestic client, or they're private firms, but they're not the proprietors. They don't own these projects. They don't own the ports. They don't own the bridges. They don't own the stadiums. But what they do, however, they leave massive visual footprints. And that's what you're seeing. So you're seeing the rise of the visual footprint of Chinese, whether it's through advertising, through construction, through these labor camps. And we don't really know what's past that. And in order to kind of understand, I want to switch now, and I want to move from move into the African perspective.
Because we have to move.
Oh, sorry. Very quickly. Well, Africa, just to give you an idea, because if we're talking about neocolonialism, I think the context is slightly different. So what Africa really experienced in the 1990s is what we call the dual liberalization, which is the political reform where we encourage people, governments essentially, authoritarian governments, to shift to multi-party democracy. But what effectively happened really was the segmentation of the original parties, and then people fragmenting from these parties and populating new parties. So we didn't really move to a multi-party democracy. We just moved to the segmentation of existing parties. So that was the democratization process in Africa in most cases, but also economic reform, so privatization, deregulation, and essentially, aligning your national development policy according to market-driven reform. So China essentially is knocking on a wide open door, Despite what you hear in the media, African leaders are fighting over themselves, competing against each other heavily for the attention of Chinese leaders. They want access to that cheap credit. They want the projects. Whether they can manage them and turn them into something, transform them into local sustainable growth is a whole other issue. But there's definitely interest, at least from African leaders, for this, this new Chinese investment or credit. But that is, of course, happening at the back of rising nationalism. So the backlash of neoliberal reform essentially is that it undermined the traditional bargaining powers, the institutions that had bargaining power in a lot of these countries. So in Zambia, which is a mine-rich, extractive country that is based on, labor-intensive industries like mining, what you had with neoliberalization was, selling off all these mines and also breaking up a lot of the social insurance that came together with the package of employment, very similar to what you saw in China. So you have a lot of disenchantment, a lot of discontent. The jobs are going, and the quality of jobs is becoming more and more unstable. And it's against this kind of rising resource nationalism that China is being singled out. And the most obvious case for that, again, is in Zambia. So ironically, this country that was kind of China's brother nation, this this kind of privileged partner of the Maoist period, became the country in which we had the first highly vocal anti-Chinese presidential candidate, who, after 3 successive presidential candidates, explicitly on an anti-Chinese ticket, so we're going to kick the Chinese out, he compared the Chinese to infestors and not investors, and he branded the Chinese thing all the time. He was really like a local Trump, populist leader, and he was eventually elected in 2011 as the leader of Zambia. Okay, I don't have time, but essentially, maybe what are they doing differently? Very quickly, they add value locally. So in the case of the mines, they built a processing plant in the mines, which the Zambians have been asking for decades, since the 1950s, 60s, and since independence. Nobody basically wanted to fund because it just wasn't profitable enough. And the Chinese add value locally in terms they wanted to do that. They invest in maybe areas like infrastructure that others didn't want to invest in. They are long-term patient investors. I think that's something we could go back on, and they are open to negotiate. Basically, in conclusion, I've had to accelerate. Often we talk about Chinese having a very hard economic agenda, and that they're ready to close their eyes on local corruption and build these sort of, dubious alliances in order to push, and close their eyes on politics. And I would argue that there is a kind of a 2-tier system, at least within state investment. The top-tier investment, when it's really strategically important for the Chinese government, they have a hard geopolitical agenda and a soft economic agenda, which means what? Which means they're willing to bear the brunt of costs on an investment. They're willing to lose money. So they will forfeit on their profits in the mines in Zambia, for example, just as they will forfeit on profits in Sri Lanka, on the port. On certain strategic areas, they're willing to compromise on their economic gains in order to gain on the political side. But if you're looking at SOEs that have a profit-driven motive, or simply, Chinese companies, private Chinese companies who just want to be sustainable on the market, they have a hard economic agenda. Okay.
We can come back to that, actually. Yeah. So that would be. Thank you very much. That's very comprehensive, actually. And now, Alicia, if you can give us some of the numbers, some of the investment numbers in China, then we'll have a good picture of to have the discussion on. If you can have Alicia's slides on, please.
Well, first of all, thanks for.
It's on. Don't worry. That will switch.
Yeah. Thanks for organizing, Maria, and for bringing us together. It's a pleasure to be here. My presentation is going to be much more boring than that of Solange, much less interesting. The good thing is going to be shorter, so bear with me for a few minutes. And I think I'm just, indeed, after that contextualization of what really Africa is for China, which I think is very important, I'm just going to go through a bunch of numbers to put that into context, because I fully agree that there is an SOE story, a private story. There is acquisitions of companies as opposed to greenfield investment. And the question really is, how big is each of it? And the numbers will actually confirm what Solange was saying, that most of what you see is actually credit, not investment. They may not actually own what we think they, meaning Chinese companies, what we think they own. They actually just lend into project finance, massive project finance projects, and that's most of what's happening actually. So it's going to be really a data-driven presentation to put that, the contextualization, into numbers. So I'm going to talk about direct investment, mergers and acquisitions, greenfield investment, and project finance, and a little bit of a sectoral landscape of where they are investing, and some conclusions as to whether, which I think is a very important question for Africa, jobs are being created out of this investment. So the first thing to say, I guess, is that, it would look as if it were only Africa receiving massive amounts of Chinese investment, and actually Africa is receiving hardly any investment, direct investment, which is what I'm showing here, compared to the rest of the world, including several emerging economies or regions such as Latin America. So first of all, it's peanuts compared to what Africa needs, and that would actually make it quite valuable that anybody, including China, invest in Africa. So I think the first point to take into account is Africa desperately needs foreign direct investment. I'm sure that Estelle will agree with this later, but I'm not going to overshadow her presentation later. So the second thing is, yes, China has is increasing its investment, direct investment in Africa. So far so good, needed, and being present. Of course, it's not the largest area of investment for China. I'm not showing that. But compared to the rest of the world, yes, there is this kind of bias towards more investment into Africa compared to what the rest of the world invests in Africa. However, the bulk of what China does in Africa, look at these numbers, we are hovering around 25 billion a year, is project finance. And this is lending. And I'm not going to get into the debt trap story anytime soon, but I'm just saying it's not the same to invest than to lend. Now, is China the largest investor in Africa? Not at all. We are the largest investors. We tend to forget this minor point here. Europe, by far, is the largest investor in Africa. We don't seem to realize, or, I don't know where our Standard Chartered signs are in French and Italian, but frankly speaking, and I very much liked, by the way, Solange's point that China is kind of changing the visual landscape. I mean, you use a different expression, but that's the idea. I think it is beyond the numbers. It's the influence that China's investment and lending is having in Africa more than the actual numbers. And is this because we are the old colonialists? Is it because we're not using our influence properly? Big questions to answer, too big for my time here, but maybe for Q&A. Now, however, our investment, our meaning Europe, and Chinese investment is slightly different, and probably Huawei is an exception because you're mainly greenfield, i.e., you do not generally buy companies. You can, of course. Maybe I'm wrong, but generally M&A, and I will show you the sectors in a minute, is basically buying companies mainly into the energy sector, resources in generally. Greenfield is actually more diversified across sectors, although not so much as you would imagine, and that's where Europe bears the bulk of the investment. So we are greenfield investors, while China is mostly an M&A investor. So this is the second idea I wanted to mention. Now these are many numbers. This is just a detail to give you a sense of how much is M&A versus greenfield. Remember, M&A, the thing I showed you at the beginning where France, UK were among the largest, that's the stock. There's many young people, so maybe this is like a little crash course on investment data. That's the all of what has been accumulated so far. What I'm showing you here is flow, meaning sometimes negative numbers, because Europe, for example, in 2017, massively divested from Africa. Maybe it sold the company to China, by the way. Most likely, because it's a big number, or several, by the way. So there's a much more kind of big wins in the M&A spectrum, because these are generally big acquisitions or divestments of companies. But the greenfield is relatively stable number. And as you see, Europe is indeed much bigger. It's about more than double China, even triple sometimes, every year. So if there are many private investors from China that you see, Solange, we should also see the private investors from Europe. Where are they? I want to know whether you met them, because the numbers are there. I don't know who they are, but they're big numbers. Now, sectoral distribution, and here I'm focusing on China because that was the purpose. I'm not going to compare with Europe. I don't even have the data, to be frank, but it would be an interesting exercise. So the bulk of the investment, again, is M&A, mostly energy, 60%. That's what it is. Beyond energy is infrastructure, metals and materials. There's a little bit of ICT, tiny, and there's no manufacturing. Where is the manufacturing? You could say, oh, no worries, manufacturing, I don't need to buy a company. I just invest greenfield. It's not there either. It's hardly textile, 7%. That's what I can find. The rest is transportation, real estate, metals, coal, a little bit of business services, 2%. But my point is, even the greenfield investment is not so much geared towards what I believe. And I'm not saying Africa doesn't need transportation or, it surely does. But frankly speaking, for such a growing population with, the share of young people which needs to be employed, somebody, and I'm not blaming China, we should do the same. I don't have the European numbers. Probably we aren't either. Somebody should be bringing the manufacturing there to create the needed jobs. On the project finance side, again, is mainly transport and energy. So even the lending is very much focused on the very same sectors. So there is a heavy concentration, in a nutshell, of either investment or lending into infra and energy, or resources and infra transport, basically, from China. Now, as you can imagine, if those are the numbers I'm seeing, this is very small, I'll guide you through very quickly. I guess you would imagine that I cannot really find major creation of jobs out of China's investment. I only have data for greenfield, and the latest thing I can have access to, this is a very expensive data set, by the way, which I had access to until recently, and it shows, other than every single greenfield investment, how many jobs per investment. It's quite amazing. So I can even tell you that in 2017, China created 99,000, which is close to what they needed to build, just one major infrastructure project back in time. But these are the jobs that have been created. It doesn't mean they have been filled by African, by the way. And I leave it there because I don't have those numbers. But I'm just saying, these are all of the jobs that have been created. And this is 1.78 jobs per million of dollars invested. Now, is this a lot? The only thing I have to compare is the average job creation of Chinese greenfield investment in the world. I'm not comparing it with Europe because I don't have those data. But I know that China, and I don't know whether China creates more or less jobs than others. I can't argue that. But I can tell that it does create much fewer jobs on average in Africa than elsewhere. And I think this is because no matter indeed the presence of private investors and greenfield, but in relative terms, there is still very much M&A, very much when it's greenfield, energy and infra. So in other words, while this investment is welcome, no doubt about it, probably even the lending, forget about the debt trap now, but surely there is huge investment needs and financing needs in Africa. But I just wish, and that's just a wish, that it were more labor intensive. And I actually think this would be good for everybody, including China down the road. So here, again, a lot of detail. You see just a little bit of a proof of what I'm saying. Textiles, as you remember, was only 7%. It creates 27% of its jobs. The jobs are in the manufacturing sector. This is what shows the point that, or the auto, which was a minor sector in terms of greenfield investment, the share. So if more jobs were moving to those manufacturing sectors, more investment, many more jobs would be created. And that's basically what I have to say. So in a nutshell, I think, yes, China has become a large investor in Africa, but Europe still is the largest. It would be extremely interesting to know what we are doing there and why we do not seem to, or we don't talk about it, or we don't seem to be there, or, some people here may disagree, but just the impression in the media is that this is a continent dominated by China. And I think this is something that we should think about, how to change that impression. Perhaps the last thing to say is it's great to have Chinese investment in Africa. Any investment is welcome. Even lending, as long as it can be paid back, and maybe if projects are well chosen, why not, and needed. But I think, importantly, all of this needs to have a plan, and this is not only China or Europe, certainly Africa, because they are the largest beneficiaries of creating the jobs needed for all of this to be sustainable, let alone the debt, which needs to be repaid. So if these jobs do not exist, not enough income will be generated to sustain this model. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia. That's great, very complementary to what we heard earlier on the numbers. But let's hear directly from industry then. Abraham, thank you so much for joining us. You're here to present you from Huawei. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. And I'm sorry for a bit late due to the traffic here. And myself, I've been working in Africa for 9 years. That was year 2002. I was 23 years old. I was sent by Huawei to Africa. That's the continent. We have only around 50 people for the whole African continent. And now, until the end of last year, we have around more than 5,000 employees, and around 70% of them are local African people. And as I said, I spent 9 years in Africa, and I did experience how the natural, environment, how beautiful it is, and how unbalanced from South Africa to Nigeria, the different country, from country to country. And I also, myself, I did participate the journey, especially in the ICT sector, ICT transformation, how the ICT technology played a role in Africa. And I still remember, I think many colleagues of mine, they must have the same experience. That's when while we entered to a certain market, built a base station in one of the village, and power on. We see the villagers, they are so happy, and they're dancing around the tower. And when the kids, the small children, they make a call from the village to his friends or relatives in Kinshasa, in the city, their eyes are lightening up. And for me, it's so clear image in my mind, because I was born in China. When I was, I only get access to the electricity when I was 11 years old. It's a remote area, village. For that reason, I think Huawei, we did play a big role in Africa in terms of bridging the digital divide. And when I went to Congo in 2004, I was the first one from Huawei, develop a new market. And I remember the tariff to make a call, at the very beginning, it is around $5 per minute. And when I leave from Africa in end of 2011, it dropped down to 10 cents around per minute. So the penetration, telecom services penetration has been increased from less than 5% for the whole continent, and last year, the figure is more than 80%. I think that, in that sense, we are proud as a Huawei people. We played such a role, and I myself, was part of the journey. And how did this ICT, technology change or impacted to the African continent? I may share you a few little stories, And one story impressed me is what happened in Kenya. We worked with the biggest operator, Safaricom. We built the nationwide, wireless network. And remember, their fixed line, was very undeveloped. So they don't have that much, legacies, for the fixed line. So they invest every money into the mobile telecommunication. And to be honest with you, when I moved from Kenya in 2012 to Jakarta in Indonesia, I was transferred to Asia Pacific. My user experience of the mobile internet is not as good as the one in Kenya. And again, in Kenya, the most famous services they provided to the people is M-Pesa, which is a wireless, cashless, wallet or money transaction system. So Kenya, they don't have a strong fixed line. They don't have a very developed credit card system, but that M-Pesa, based on the apps or short message services from the mobile phone, played a great role, a big role in Kenya to help people to transfer money from the capital city when they get paid from the job to their village, to their relatives in a rural suburban area. And if you are interested in, you can discover more from one of the interview from CNN interviewed the ex-CEO, from Safaricom, Michael, my friend, and Michael Joseph. And that's one of the story. And another story, actually, it was not my story. I was told by the Professor Nicholas Negroponte. He's the founder of the MIT Media Lab. And he did a trial in Ethiopia, in one of the very remote area where there is no electricity. And people don't have, most of the people, they don't know even a word in writing. You see, so what they did, they sent a few tablets with the access of the internet, mobile internet, but they didn't have that before. So they sent those tablets, and the quantity of the tablets is equal to the children's. There are like 10 children, 10 tablets, and plus a solar power, socket. So after they just leave it there, and then they leave. They monitor from a wireless camera what is happening. So what happened is, they said, so within like 1 week, so without any extra instruction, they began to sing ABC songs. They just discovered by themselves, and within 2 weeks, they were using more than 50 apps per day for 7 hours per day. And that 7 hours is the battery life for 1 day before they charge it from the solar panel. And 6 months later, they hacked Android. And this story is not my story. It's from Nicholas Negroponte. And this actually impressed me, what kind of role will the digital technology possibly play in the whole continent. And for that reason, I think our journey in Africa, or our partnership, with our customer in Africa is really meaning, about a lot more things, not, from the just kind of business or investment. It's much more than that. And, I would like to share with you the last message is our collaboration in Africa. Quite often it is been talked as one of the Chinese investment or Chinese development in Africa. But in many cases, in our case especially, it's a collaboration. It's a much bigger story. It's more about Huawei's collaboration with our European players. Because, for example, when I was in Africa, in Congo, I was the first CEO of Huawei in Congo, and my first customer is Vodacom. Vodacom is a subsidiary of Vodafone, you see. And then we have Orange. Orange is actually a European operator. So a lot of collaboration and a lot of innovation, we bring to African continent is co-developed with our European stakeholders. For example, one of the rural stars. Rural star, because in Africa, in many places, the density is not so high, the population density. So if the operator only invests based on the business case, in many situations, the remote area won't be easily covered. So what we do, we develop some very cost-effective all-in-one, we call it rural star. So we have the solar power, and the base station can be easily installed in a simple pole, so that you get a cost-effective solution and a fast deployment of this kind of system. And these are kind of joint efforts together with our customer. And if you ask me about the future, because we are here in Europe, we are talking about the ICT as an enabler to transform the vertical industry in the future, about 5G. And I would like to say, our collaboration here in European continent, may play an even bigger role in the future. in Africa continent to help that continent to leapfrog, jumping into the new information society. In that sense, some of the less developed, status in Africa, or the less strict regulatory status may help the other continent in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very useful. And let's go straight to Estelle for the last word, as it were, in this first round, and then we have a conversation.
Thank
Estelle.
you. Thank you. A pleasure to be with you this morning. Thank you for having me this morning, and Alicia, especially for sending the invitation. I'm a journalist, therefore I know very little, and I'm not as competent as my fellow panelists. I just would want to comment, therefore, on everything that is being said. I think that what is most interesting in our guest from Huawei is the different perspective, which sums up how China and the EU are very different in seeing Africa. For the Europeans, the main discussion, the main conversation regarding Africa is the migrants. It's a security threat, it's a problem. Looking south is bringing anxiety to Europeans, and we all have in mind what we do in the media is showing people, showing pictures of boat peoples which are mostly coming from Africa. Nonetheless, the reality of migration to Europe is coming from the Middle East, Afghanistan, Asia, and not from Africa. Therefore, there's a problem of perception, which is playing heavily into the politics and the policies from the EU towards Africa. It is playing heavily to the point where this morning, preparing for this presentation, because of course I'm so very prepared, I Googled and then I went on the EU website, and then EU-Africa relationships in figures, EU aid, that's the first figure, represents more than 50% of global aid. Africa is not a market. The first perception is that it is a continent that is in desperate need of aid. That in itself poses a major problem from the African perspective. The whole difference, because I'm going back to the title of the discussion, what is the implication of having China in Africa, is that it changes the game for Africans. We are not in a tête-à-tête anymore. We're having different players to the table. We're playing competition. I say we because I'm African, as well as French, but I'm African as well. Therefore, when you have a new player in town, Chinese are hot, they can be cheap, they're less demanding regarding conditionalities, they're open, and they're willing to go the extra mile. For Africans, it's good news. Of course, the honeymoon period is over. Africans are, becoming a bit more skeptics regarding contracts. Some would say we never learn fast enough, but it has changed the conversation. Moving on to the second issue of the European-Africa relationship, if we go back to business and trade and economics, 70% of goods exported from the EU to Africa are manufactured goods. 60% of goods imported from Africa to the EU are primary goods. They are raw material, energy, food and drinks. It's an unbalanced relationship. If you look at the value chain, Africa is at the bottom, Europe is at the top. But if we go deeper, the EU and China are competitors in terms of what they're producing in terms of manufactured goods. Are the European products meeting the African consumers' needs? That's the question. Why is the EU not looking at Africa as a market? Probably because they assume that Africans don't have the spending power that could buy the European products. China is looking at it in a different way, very smartly. They look at the projected growth for Africa in 2025, 3.5 on average. I'm saying on average because The point of view from Europe is to forget that it's 54 countries. It is so very diverse, with very different economies. Europe is still looking at the continent with two continents, MENA, the North African Arab, but in a European slang you would say it's the Arab Africa, therefore it's not Africa. For sub-Saharan Africa, it's a different reality. For the Chinese, it's a continent, different markets, different realities, they adapt. The last thing I wanted to mention, and you touched on it, is how China is partnering up with Europe to attack the African market. Interestingly, my president, President Macron, on his first visit to China, dedicated a third of his first speech in China to talk about Africa. Meaning that in the European point of view, Africa, if the Europeans cannot do without China in Africa, let's work together. For Africans, it's the Europeans ganging up with the Chinese against them. Therefore, at the moment, we're at a pivotal time when the change and having a competition regarding Africa is being diminished. I also wanted to point out that this week there was the annual meetings of Afreximbank, which is an African investment bank, that was being held in Moscow. Moscow is planning on holding its first ever African-Russian summit that will be in October in Russia, meaning that you have a whole lot of new players. And that changes the game for Africans. The question for Europeans, are they prepared to change their view and their offer towards Africa? Are they willing to adapt? If we look at what the needs are for Africa, it's $150 billion a year in investment in infrastructure. Meaning that if the EU is willing to invest in Africa, there is room. 150 billion a year. Not a single country can respond to the need of Africans in terms of infrastructure investments. It's simply impossible, regardless of how vast the reserves of China in terms of money they would be willing to spend, it would not have enough to meet the demand of Africa. And in terms of business, it would not make sense. Why would you put all your eggs in the same basket? The question, I think, from a European point of view is also to look at the economic partnerships agreements which are being negotiated between the EU and African sub-regions. So far, none of them have been ratified and signed. The main opponents, Nigeria, Tanzania, if I'm not mistaken, are the big players in the continent. But what is most interesting is how the discussion is going in Africa. One, African countries, because the discussion has taken place last year in Abidjan, the African countries talked to their European counterparts and said, you know what, who are we signing with? Are we signing with the EU, but with or without the UK? Brexit played heavily. They were like, sort out your Brexit mess and then come back to us. That plays because if you look, and that's what Alicia touched on, the EU is the institution, but it's all individually European countries investing in individual African countries. Therefore, that's why it's so hard to paint a full picture. The French have their former colonial sphere of influence, the Brits have their own, and then you have secondary players in Africa. Italy, Portugal, a little Spain, a little Belgium, a little Germany, therefore it's scattered. So if you have the UK gone, you just have France left as a big player. France is scrambling, they don't have enough money to fund their influence. Most of the French influence is a security, a military influence, and it has led fall a bit the economic influence. That poses a problem. So the Africans said, sort out the Brexit first, and then we might think about it. Second, they said to their European partners, you know what, if we sign the economic partnership agreements, that will destroy our agriculture. It's already an unfair trade agreement, but if we go further, that will prevent us from going up in the value chain, which is the main objective of all African countries. Because, as Alicia explained, the demographic ticking bomb is on the mind of most African leaders, and they're thinking we need to create jobs. Africa being the largest reserve of arable land, because of the growing population on the planet, you will have to one day feed them, you will need to grow the food in Africa. Agriculture is labor intensive, there you go, it's a great deal, but African countries also realize, looking at their figures, we need to produce, wheat or whatever, but we need to actually sell flour. We cannot just produce wheat. We have to go up the value chain. So they're saying, the EPAs are not a good thing. They will prevent us from going up in the value chain. We need to get special conditions. And African countries are saying the EPAs would be competing with the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is the biggest project in terms of free trade within the continent. And I think that's an interesting thing, positive thing for the Europeans. The Africans are being inspired by the European project to build an economic free trade zone. Some would argue we could learn from our mistakes, but still it's working. And it is fast moving forward. And I think that the interesting thing about that is that at the same time, France has started the discussion around ending the CFA, le franc CFA, which is an inheritance from the colonial era where France is holding the reserves, the monetary reserves of several Western countries, West African countries, and now President Macron has opened the discussion to say maybe we should allow those countries to hold their reserves, change the name of the franc CFA, and probably change the symbols. Therefore, there is some sort of an understanding that things cannot go on as usual. And I think that in a way, that's the biggest contribution of China in Africa. In a sort of probably not anticipated vision, indirectly, it has changed the conversation because it has created a triangle. And it's not just a triangle. You have Turkey, you have Brazil, which is also investing a lot in Africa. You have all sorts of new players who are coming in the back of China and saying, if the Chinese are going there, then maybe there is actually a market. If we can go in and have a basic plus offer for an African market, there is money to be made. And I think that for Africans, it's something that is new and that they want to pursue, that they want others to learn from. And I think that for Europeans, that's a good message. The last thing I wanted to know, because that's important, that's relevant to this discussion. This weekend, there has been a coup attempt in Ethiopia. As Alicia mentioned, it is one of the largest chunk of Chinese investment in Africa. The question posed by the coup, the attempted coup in Ethiopia, it's not the first. It's been very unstable. Some may know that there's a change in Ethiopia with a new reformist president, a new prime minister. It's very shaky. It started peace with its neighbors. It started opening up. It's democratizing with a multi-party sort of political dialogue. There is change in one of the giant countries of the continent where China has invested massively, where it has interests, and after Sudan, it's one where African observers are looking how Beijing will react. The same way they looked at how Beijing reacted to what happened with Mugabe. Meaning that we went from China being an economic player to understanding that it's now a political and military player in Africa and has to be taken into the equation as a big player. And that's, I was talking about yesterday, after the Pax Americana, the Pax of the French, it's Pax China. What does it mean for Africa? Because if you have economic interests, you have to protect them. That's common sense.
Thank you very much, Stella. Very interesting points. I mean, I wish we had a little bit more time to talk about the trade issues because we're talking mostly about investment. But Alicia, the numbers you showed, they were the investment, the European investment. It wasn't development aid, right? No. It was, so Europe is still the biggest investor in Africa. If I can, so I mean. And the US, yeah. So I mean, it's not entirely correct that Europe doesn't see Africa as a market. It is, right? If I see your numbers there, it's not just China. But it's an interesting point you make, Estelle, that actually the presence of China in Africa just changed the dynamic in terms of who invests where. So and the title has consequences for Europe. So I mean, if you allow me to come back to the issue of what it all means for Europe, and I think you've touched on this, Estelle, in very interesting ways. But understanding China and the interest of China and the scope for development in China, domestically, within China and also abroad, is extremely interesting actually for the discussion on trade issues worldwide, the US. All of this is a balance that has been shifted, altered as a result of China becoming a bigger player. And I wanted to come back to you, Solange, to this issue of the business model. If you can elaborate a little bit on what you said on about the Chinese business model and the need for change. What did you mean by that, and the soft power versus hard power? What did you mean by all that in terms of how China needs to change its business model to integrate better in the world?
Well, I mean, essentially, the point is that the conditions that enabled China's miraculous growth, essentially, which means a large demographic dividend. It had a window of opportunity where the world was rich and needed goods and had the money to pay for the goods that China could produce with foreign technology. And what you had was massive technology transfer to China at a period where it slowly climbed up, the value chain, the industrial value chain. But China wants better quality jobs. The question, to bring it back to Africa, yes, is China generating jobs or not? But the main issue is there any possible for structural change and industrial upgrade, which is what we go into on. And that's where China is at. China is now sort of, it's got its back at the wall, and it's basically the demographic dividend, which is basically a large pool of underqualified, cheap, flexible labor, which China had. China doesn't have that anymore. So it's looking actually to shift its manufacturing base, its low-end manufacturing base, to other parts of the world, including Southeast Asia, including Africa. Essentially what it's saying is it's looking for countries that looked like China did in the 1980s. And Africa is that. Africa has large reserves of disposable, politically weak, politically voiceless, cheap labor force. Can they, integrate into these value chains the way that China did? It depends, because, the economic equation is never a purely economic equation. It happens within a social context, which is what I tried to highlight, Specifically, it happens in, it needs good policies to integrate it. You need to complement good economic policies with good social policies, with an accent on education. You need relatively strong laws, etc., a strong legal framework for all that to happen. But essentially, what we're looking at is a shrinking labor force in China. People often talk about China has the largest population. It has a shrinking labor force, and it's becoming more and more expensive. And it has an aging population. So it's very simple. Within the next 20 years, China has a very small window of opportunity to essentially get its act together and move away from being export-driven, export-dependent. Its economy has to sort of, in a way, become more autonomous compared to the global market and rely on domestic consumption, but a healthy domestic consumption, and what we call indigenous innovation. So, really R&D, research and development-driven innovation.
It's interesting. If I may
this is the industrial policy, obviously, behind all of this, behind 2025 issues.
But on the export side, I mean, if you look at the numbers per capita, China exports about, per capita, it exports about $1,500 to the world. That's the value of its exports per capita. The American equivalent is $3,000. The French is $9,000 to $10,000 per capita. The German is 18,000. So, I mean, if there is to the extent that export models work, and the French and German numbers include the single market within Europe, but still there is an export-based model that Europe has exploited for many, many years. And if China has space to do that, I mean, by comparison, even if it were to go to the American numbers, it still has a long way to go. So, I mean, it would be interesting to know whether China can and will want to follow the export-led growth in the future as others did. Of course, China has scale. And therefore, if China went to go down the US let's say, export model, it would become gigantic in the global context. I think that might go some way towards explaining why the US is so, may I say, uncomfortable, if nothing else. But I mean, is it a question mark? Is this the future? Or you seem to answer that it's not the future.
No, we both no.
Okay.
It can't.
Yeah. Okay.
China were to export 80,000.
But don't take 80,000. Take the US number.
They would need the moon.
Yeah.
Not enough
That's
people
right.
in this world to buy those 80,000
That's right.
per person.
That's right.
And this is the problem. China is too big for everybody.
Yeah.
It's simply too big for everybody. So and this is why they're in a way trapped in their model.
You need your
Sorry, because they, in a way, you're right, Mary. I mean, probably they thought, wow, we can become the Germany of the world. They already did long time ago.
Yeah.
They have 30% of global manufacturing.
Yeah.
Nobody on earth got there. So if we were to push that to $80,000 per capita,
everything will be made in China.
Maybe that's why you are discovering the other side of the moon, to see if you find somebody there. Because there's not enough people in the world who can afford those goods. No matter how much this middle income class in Africa, in India, it's just impossible. So I think they need to change their model. Yeah. There's no way out.
Okay, very good. Yes.
But I think that's where the Chinese perception of Africa is interesting. They see the continent as a reservoir of the working force that is disappearing back home, and they see the continent as the reservoir of consumers that will absorb the cheap production, because
as well as resources.
As well as resources. Therefore, I think that the African bride is very sexy in Chinese eyes, because the surplus that we talked about are being absorbed by Africans. And then the Chinese, I don't know, if it's right or wrong, but perceive that there is a huge potential of growth in that market, as well as a potential workforce. And in that, it's a holistic approach. We employ this growth dividend, this bulge of youth in Africa. We help Africans create this manufacturing, consumers, large working class that will consume, and therefore we can help in terms of domestically having this surplus being sold, so it's not lost, and then we can. And I visited and reported on the factories which are being built by the Chinese in Ethiopia, for example. Because the Chinese workforce is becoming too expensive, you have that disposable workforce in massive numbers in Africa. Therefore, let's transfer some of our not so cheap now factories which were based in China. We are transferring them to Africa. But I also think that it is interesting that for African leaders, it is a project that they are buying into for their own political survival. It's something that there is no other country that is making them such an offer.
Yeah. Okay, but
I'm not saying it's realistic.
Can we just take some questions from the audience as well and come back to the conversation, because I want the audience to be involved as well. Can we have the gentleman here and then the gentleman here? Let's start from. Can you please introduce yourselves?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Laurent Bonneau, I'm an independent scholar. The debates suggested four questions to me. Luckily enough, Estelle raised three of them, which are namely the Brexit impact, the currency role, or changing international currency role, especially in Africa, following investment and changes in investments. And the fourth question was putting in economic perspective the recent events in Ethiopia. Yeah. I would be very interested to hear developments of the other panelists on these three questions.
Okay.
The 4th point is a bit more technical. concerning project finance and maybe PPPs, private-public partnerships in Africa. Has there been a change too in the patterns of governance for project finance following Chinese investment in this field? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Then gentleman here, please, at the front. Anybody at the back?
Hi, Chen Wei from China Daily. Yeah, just a very brief comment on the question. I mean, actually, you know, U.S. also import from Africa. 90% of the import to the U.S. is natural resources. So don't get it like China. I mean, we import a lot of natural resources from Canada, Australia, and they love to export that to China. I mean, I just
Can you keep your microphone, because there's people...
I just hate to see headlines. I'm a journalist. I mean, fellow journalists see headlines like describe everything China, Africa as geopolitical. I mean, in fact, Europe goes to Africa, it's a counter-China. I mean, as you said very well, I think Africa is big enough. I mean, they need American, European, I mean, Indian, South Korean, Japanese, Chinese, I mean, to invest in infrastructure. I don't spend 9 years in Africa. I spend 9 days in Ethiopia. I mostly spend every day and night in the East Industrial Zone. Actually, it's your competitor, ZTE, built all the telecom infrastructure in Ethiopia. I mean, Huawei joined later. But you know, it's an amazing story. I talked to an Ethiopian employee that ZTE actually, they're so proud to pay to support the family. It makes them so proud as a family member. You know, the Huajian, the shoemaker in industrial zone created 4,000 jobs that's like 6 years ago. They promised to produce. I mean, the news headline today is that actually they are going to launch. They're just about to complete another industrial zone called Dawa. Yeah. I don't know. It's huge.
So do you also have a question, please?
Yeah, my question is really, I mean, I really like to hear from the panelists how actually you would advise China, Europe, I mean, America, everyone to join hands. I mean, you know, it's like building infrastructure, Asia, Africa, Latin America, not to just call it a geopolitical rivalry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there a question? We can take a third question, or yes, here, please.
I'm formerly with the European Commission. I have a question for the representative of Huawei. It's quite obvious now that geopolitics is becoming a new form of risk for tech companies. And it's a difficult task how to manage that. I'm wondering, given you have a conflict with China, with Canada, and other experiences, have you been preparing how to deal with those geopolitical risks? And if you have been preparing, how you do that? What kind of preparation as a tech company in that difficult geopolitical area?
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps then we can ask can we start from you, Abraham, if you don't mind?
To answer your question, I think maybe most of the audience has been following all the developments. Every day while we're under spotlight, and the whole background, I don't have to explain, you know, while we as a victim now under the attack of the superpower of the world, you know, the U.S. administrations. And, you know, I have to say, in Huawei side, we have a project called Business Continuity Management, which has been started 15 years ago under the consultant from the U.S. consultant company called IBM. So while we have been assumed all the extreme situation, including what is happening now. So in a certain way, we have prepared, and we are confident that we are going to survive. Obviously, there are impact, you know, to our customers and the consumers, but they are minor one, you know. But overall, if you look at the whole picture of the industry, it's even. I think it's even more dangerous than in Huawei's own case, because the ICT industry has been, I think, one of the most global collaborated, you know, industry. Every vendor from our industry, no matter is Huawei or Ericsson or Nokia, Siemens or Cisco, our nature is actually more or less the same. We are global R&D, global supply chain, and global services. You know, can you imagine? Ericsson also have their 80% of their equipment manufactured in China, and they have more than 10,000 R&D people in China. while we have more than 12,000 people in Europe, and we invest heavily in Europe as well. A lot of innovation are actually working together with the European universities or R&D researchers. So in a bigger extent, Huawei's solution is part of European innovation. But what happened is the US government, without ignoring all the legal processes, and announced that we are a sort of national security threat to the US government. By the way, they said the German cars also the national security threat to them. Toyota also the national security threat to them. So they have misused this concept of national security threat, and now target to the international company like Huawei. And we are confident that we are going to go through all this, and we are, but the danger is to any the other international companies. I think the founder of ARM from UK, the ARM, the chipset company, he has publicly said his friends are all considering of mitigate the dependence to the US suppliers, because who knows one day, what kind of reason will, the same reason will be applied, and what happened to the other smaller, less prepared international company, from the. I would like to quote one of the announcement from the chairman of the U.S. Companies Association, related to China. He said, this is actually a kind of murder, activity of murder to international companies. So the threat is for the whole industry. And specifically in Huawei case, we have some minor impact. And the leading solutions like the 5G or the core network, like the optical transmission, those solutions are still maintained, completed to our customer. And our colleagues across, are working very closely with our customers, and they still maintain a strong confidence on Huawei case.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is a complex issue, and the issue of, we have events on this issue very often, actually, and understanding the US, but understanding also complex issues, new issues, data protection, all of these issues, technological pass-through. These are issues that are complicated, and I think the question that was here came from our audience was about how do you prepare for these risks, and I think that's them, whether they are risks that are going to materialize or they're not going to materialize, or whether they're legitimate or not. It's a different question, but preparing for the possibility of these things is something that I think what the question was mostly. But our other panelists, Estelle, would you like to take some of the questions? How do you kind of cooperate at the global level? Rather than compete in geopolitics?
I'm no diplomat. I would be bad at that. But I think that the African perspective is that collaboration is probably against African interests. For Africa, competition has been good news. Cartels are not so much good news for Africa. Therefore, the whole attitude of let's collaborate against Africa is not too well received on the continent. But I wanted to answer the question around the renminbi. I think that it's a very interesting question because in its pursuit of making renminbi an international currency reserve, China has worked very efficiently at creating swaps with African countries. So far, it's Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, and then I think Sudan so far, and counting. And the idea is also to have African central bankers lobbying to have the renminbi part of the basket of the IMF. And so I think that's a very smart move, meaning that if you have your goods sold on the continent and you make sure that that line of trade is made in your own currency, you're not only increasing the footprint of the renminbi, but you're securing that trade from interferences from Washington. I think that's a very, very smart and strategic move, and long-term, that is, of course, observed, and it's worrying the EU as well as Washington. I also would want to mention the fact that where is the EU on the IT digital economy in Africa discussion? That's the biggest question I think that this asks. You know, if you look at what my colleague described, yes, the mobile networks has helped Africa leapfrog, and it is crucial. If you have Mr. Zuckerberg flying to Nigeria, it's not because of the weather. It's because it's the largest market where you have, as Mr. pointed out, no legislation to protect the data. It is a problem not to have the EU in that discussion. And it's not just an industrial problem. It's because you have, at the moment, 9% of African GDP created by the digital economy. And it will be growing. So the European investors are not investing in that. One would say, okay, Huawei is just providing the mobile phones. But as the journalist points out, no, the Chinese are building the telecommunication infrastructures. They're providing the tubes as well. Where are European companies in that market? Why aren't we betting on digital Africa? For many reasons, I'm asking that, because, for example, when you look at IBM investing in Africa, when you look at other companies, because of the diversity on the continent and because of the low infrastructure, Africans are a land of innovation, digital innovation, to a degree which is inspiring. You know, the democracies, for example, in Kenya, was the first country to experience digital campaigns. You know, it's you know, Western world discovered it in the US, but it's actually in Kenya where there was the most digital footprint on politics. But what I'm looking at is also the fact that because of the diversity in terms of languages, of ethnicities, and low tech, you have the most creative programmers. You have the most innovative apps. Therefore, it's a land which is overlooked by European investors, where other countries, and it's not just China, it's also India, who we did not mention in the discussion, but it's crucial if one wants to understand what's going on in Africa, in the eastern part of the continent. One has to understand also the competition between India and China.
Okay, I think that Solange Belbado will give you the floor, and then Alicia will close, because I think we are coming to an end.
Just in terms about, where are the interfaces for synergy and cooperation? Well, if you speak to African leaders or Chinese actors in Africa, or whether they're heads of a state-owned company or companies, very often, and I've put this to ambassadors and different people I interviewed, I said, where do you see, is there any sort of room for innovation? They very often sort of answer the same thing, say, we're guests in this country. We will go with whatever the local hosts want to do. They push the ball back into the court of their hosts, and they say, if the hosts want us to do something, then we will, investigate and go down that road. But we will never sort of unilaterally make a decision on how there can be some sort of trilateral cooperation framework and impose that framework onto the domestic country. And I think that's really interesting, because it's essentially saying, look, again, giving agency, I don't like the term, but essentially just asking the people on the ground, what would they like?
What do you mean by that? Because the sectors...
They will not, I mean, of course it depends. If you look at industrial, okay, I mean, of course, if we're talking about, specific sectors within the private sector, how does that work? I mean, that's different. You have huge industrial cooperation going on, let's say, within the shipping industry. So you have massive Chinese shipping companies and port authorities who are collaborating with, some of the Danish and French monopolies in the market. That's what's happening kind of on a global level. But if you're looking at political frameworks, in terms of
different,
yeah, but that's very important, because that's what we're talking about. That's where these are the kind of parameters. You cannot stop Marx, the Danish company, and tell them what to do, and tell them how to operate their ports in Africa. You cannot tell Bolloré to basically collaborate with China in Africa. These companies are above the law, they're above states. So if we're going back to the level, of how can states collaborate, that's kind of how they think. The Chinese will say, well, we'll look at how, the local what the local leaders want, and we'll do that. And going back to the local leaders in terms of regime change in Ethiopia, I'm going to say this again. I think China is a patient investor. They're not new to Africa. They're not new to the volatility on the continent. They understand, the fundamental nature and physics of politics. And I think they're in it they're playing the long game. That doesn't mean that they will change their strategies and their tactics to react to change on the ground. And I do think that as more investment and more credit is being loaned to Africa, China will get to a point where it will say, how much losses can it take? They will get to a point where China will say, okay, I can lose, but at what point? And then, of course, we get to the militarized question. I think we're still very, very far off in terms of security. China really, if you don't even look at Chinese military activity on the continent, look at Chinese military activity within China. Their armed forces don't have any combat experience. China has not been in war, for decades. So, in fact, what it's got a blue helmet force that is peacekeeping force in Africa. It is increasing its humanitarian intervention, so it's sending people to Mozambique when there are natural disasters taking place. But I think we're still very far from. Why would it invest and wait for ages to scale up when it can just, maybe rely on people like Prince, modern. What are they called? Mercenaries. We have that. We have private security companies that can protect certain things. I'm not saying it'll go down that road, but I'm saying China has several options. I don't think it's going to deploy its army across Africa now. I think it's really investing in specific innovative technologies. It has a very clear idea of what it wants to do, going back to kind of it wants to essentially move from a made-in-China model, which is the base of manufacturing hub of the world, to a made by China and be the owners of the patents, basically, of the technology of tomorrow. So it's very different.
Thank you very much for that. But Alicia, you have the last word. But can I ask you also to comment on this, on the point you made that China gives credit, it does not do FDI. Can you elaborate on this, because it has something on the commitment side that I would like you to elaborate on.
Yeah. So I guess we have 1 minute left. Many questions plus one more. I'm going to be very brief. Yes, Solange, you are right that that's what we would expect from China. I would expect China to sit there and, and
wait.
Yeah, take the fruits that, the tree that has planted. But that's not what I see. That's not what I see in the data, in the sense that I think China is becoming more like us, in the sense that China wants to protect its investment in the same way we did, because it's now so much more than when they invested in the in the railway, in the Zambia railway. It's just so much more important for companies like Huawei or others. CT, we just heard, in Ethiopia. I think they are starting to become nervous about their investments in the world. And you just told us about Ethiopia, what happened. So why I would do the same. I just don't blame them, because that's what everybody else has done. And in that regard, I think that we'll probably see more, forceful action and more short-term lending rather than investment. Because if it were the case that in this long-term thinking, China is thinking of Africa as its new manufacturing power, the numbers do not support that at all. It's literally nothing what China has so far invested in manufacturing in Africa, to the extent of what is needed. China has invested much more in Vietnam than in Africa, and thus, if this continent is their future, they should show it to me. As simple as that. So this is my recommendation. I agree that Africa needs it, so let's show it. And not only China, everybody else, because the numbers are not there for anybody. Do not feel threatened, or, it's not true for any country. No. Africa is the least, the smallest recipient of FDI in the world. And much less so if you look at manufacturing. So it's not China, it's everybody else, for that matter. So this would call for more of a multilateral engagement, so people won't come and say, and you're saying, we're coming with so many other suppliers, but when you make your advertisement, it's you showing your 5G, nobody else. So I'm saying, why don't we have more kind of alliances? I know we can't force anybody, Solange, you're absolutely right, but I think that would reduce the geopolitical risk of the whole story. So more manufacturing FDI, more alliances in those sectors where it is possible. I'm not sure whether yours is one, but I guess after hearing you, it seems it is, because that's what you're doing, not maybe what the sector is showing, not necessarily you. And also, less lending and more aid. You complain about aid from Europe. I wish that we had that amount for China. If you look at China's aid, Africa is one of the smallest recipients. So,
but the AD doesn't want aid.
Well, but then get lending and get into the debt trap. You know, if you look at Lao.
But it's a matter of choice. That's what we.
I mean, I'm just saying. I don't know whether aid is the solution. Certainly not loans at rates that are unpayable for infrastructure that is bound to last for 30 years. With loans, the average maturity of a loan is 3 years. So, you know, I don't know whether aid is the solution. Certainly not the amount of project finance lending in the current circumstances. Let alone the fact that it's basically policy banks from China, meaning you don't have a set of investors with which you can play. It's a single lender. So, or two, Exim Bank. And so I think the model now might not be, I mean, maybe aid is, you know, I think the problem with aid is the way we do it, not necessarily that it's free.
It's never free.
It's not free. It's never free. But if you pay 7% annual 3 year to finance an infrastructure project, you're even worse off. You might not be able to pay. And we heard about the port of Mombasa, which was actually not true that it was sized, but close to that. So you may end up without owning the asset. So I'm just thinking that there's a lot of things we could do. Multilateral, less lending, maybe not aid, then invest. Then invest. Yeah. You don't like aid, invest. But I would not get into the massive lending that Africa. I mean, the World Bank has come up with quite a few numbers as to how much countries are borrowing. The stream case, actually, the stream cases are not in Africa. They are in Lao, PDR. These countries have increased their debt to China of the order of 200% in 5 years. So I think this is not sustainable. And I'm not saying that China wants to trap them. If I were the lender, I wouldn't want to trap anybody. I want to be paid back. It's actually the responsibility of the borrower, no doubt about it. But I think this is an unsustainable model for anybody on earth, let alone a country like Africa that doesn't have the jobs needed to create the disposable income, which will then pay the debt for the infrastructure that you may or may not need. Some of it may be needed. Some of it may not have even been the choice of the country itself. So to me, this is kind of a unsustainable model. It's welcome, but welcome if it's redefined in a more sustainable way. That would be my last word. Yeah.
Thank you, Alicia, very much. I mean, and I know yet you need to go, so I'm afraid we have to bring this to an end. Estelle, Solange, Abraham, and Alicia, thank you so much for joining us this very hot morning here at Bruegel. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.